Welcome everyone back to the Global Business Insights podcast. Today's conversation is supported by Xeneta, the AI-powered freight intelligence solution trusted by the world's largest shippers, forwarders and carriers. Xeneta turns fragmented freight data into a single market view, helping teams cut unnecessary costs, forecast with confidence and build resilient supply chains. Today, we're going somewhere a little further out. Literally, we're talking about space as the next supply chain frontier. In-orbit manufacturing, lunar and Mars logistics, satellite supply chain networks, and what it means to run a supply chain where the lead times are measured in years and there's zero room for error. Our guest today, we're delighted to welcome is John Callison. John brings deep experience thinking about supply chains at the edge of what's possible. John, welcome to the show. Please introduce yourselves to our listeners.
Thanks, Max. It's great to be here. I'm John Callison. I've been in the sourcing industry for 20 plus years, where companies such as Meta, Workday, SAP, Oracle. I've worked at the intersection of sourcing and supply chain, critical infrastructure for multiple companies, and I am currently working across multiple advisory roles. Most of my background has been in technology sourcing with focus on data centers, as well as almost anything else you can think of in the technology space. And I do say space intentionally because I'm currently focused on orbital compute in the industrial base that's now forming to support in-orbit manufacturing and off-planet logistics. Very happy to be here.
Fantastic. Thanks, John. Great to have you. Charlotte, Burkard, my co-hosts, over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Max, as always, for the great introduction. John, thank you for being here. My gosh, I'm so excited for our conversation now. And I think with no further ado, let's get into our first question. That is probably a burning question in everyone's mouth right now. Starting with the whole big picture. John, why is space becoming such a big conversation in supply chain management right now, rather than a decade from now?
Primarily because of our current planet's infrastructure. We do not have the power supply, the power availability to support all the growth with in the AI compute space, which means our hyperscale data centers are running out of places to be. If you look at the news today, you'll see multiple hyperscale infrastructure projects being canceled on a regular basis. States within the US and other countries are saying we do not want these data centers near our communities, the impact on environment, impact on local establishments, etc. So that hyperscale data center has to go somewhere. Where is that going to go? There's been a lot of thoughts around that, but the industry is starting to move towards orbit. You put a satellite in space that has compute capacity, and you now have technically a data center in space. It's just how that looks in the future.
Very exciting, John, to hear that. And I was thinking for many of us, obviously, our supply chains are still in a more conventional world, meaning here on Mother Earth. What does actually zero fault tolerance means in practice when you're on a space mission or supply chain?
So the biggest difference between orbital and terrestrial data centers is every single thing in space is critical in nature. If there's a single fault, if there's a single failure in technology, literally it could cost lives. It could cost the equipment up there to fail. It could be so impactful if it is not set to a certain tolerance to make it a zero fault technology, that it would literally compromise a multi-billion-dollar asset with a single piece of equipment failing. So what it looks like when you're saying zero fault tolerance, it literally has to be something where it's looked at as a non-recoverable failure. It cannot fail. It cannot have a single like circuit that doesn't work. If it did, you could compromise, a 2-year mission that has a very, very short launch window. And now you just ruined that project because of that technology having a failure. Zero fault means no failure.
Wow, thank you for explaining, John. And also another question for our procurement professionals out there. How do you plan procurement cycles that can span years rather than just months? And maybe you can explain a little bit, what does long lead time planning look like at the extreme, in your opinion?
So, from my perspective, in talking to people in the industry, basically what you do is you build backwards from a launch window. In most cases on terrestrial data centers, you're looking at, hey, we need to have this up and running in 2 years. That's typical, data center is going to be built. We have to start planning where this equipment goes, how it goes, what's going to happen with it based on where the technology is available and how fast that data center is going to be built. In the reverse is true for orbital technology. You need to know the launch window and when that is available for whatever equipment you're sending into orbit. And from that perspective, you build your lead time based on that window. So if, for example, you knew radiation hardened electronics were going to arrive 6 weeks late, you don't just slip it into the schedule and say, hey, we're going to push the schedule out by 2 weeks. You need to build that in and plan for that so that the only launch window you may have in December of 2028, for example, every single thing, even if it had to wait and sit for a little bit, is ready and able to go at that moment. The launch window is your target.
It's a totally different world than to everything else that many supply chain professionals are dealing with now. So I think it's very exciting. How close are we realistically to being operational supply chain concerns rather than really research projects?
That is a great question, Burkard. And there's examples literally in orbit today. China has a working orbital data center. It's low compute capacity, but it's still actually active and up and running. The ESA is looking at multiple projects depending on which arm of it. France has a project that is close to being loftable. NASA's Artemis program is already contracting for lunar surface power and communications. Blue Origin's Moonlander, for example, is scheduled to deliver cargo this year. As a matter of fact, they had obviously a well-publicized launch failure recently, but that piece of equipment was expected to drop data center equipment on the surface of the moon, for example. So it is happening today. Most companies are not necessarily set from a supply chain perspective or a sourcing perspective, but there are bespoke technologies that are being created today to have equipment in orbit.
Thank you so much for sharing, John. And now if we move to the whole notion of supplier qualifications, what does supplier qualification actually look like in an industry where literally a single component failure could end a whole mission? And I come from an automotive background. How is that different from supplier risk management in, let's say, automotive or manufacturing?
That is an awesome question, Charlotte. And I love that you brought up the automotive industry, because that's where we actually need to be from a orbital supply chain perspective. Having that Ford assembly line kind of industry where you could say this piece of equipment is going to be built lockstep, just bang, 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 bang. Here it is. It's duplicatable. It's replicatable. It can be used today as a plug and play piece of technology. That's where we need to be. But the main components to that, and what does it look like, is every piece of equipment that you are putting into orbit has to be able to be space rated, is what they're calling it, which has radiation tolerances, vibration profiles, life cycle validation, environmental testing. What that really looks like is a standard like NVIDIA GPU, which is an outstanding piece of equipment, needs to be able to deal with the launch boost pressure, for example. It has to be able to be shaken much harder than it is today, and the pieces of equipment have to be radiation tolerant, because as it gets higher up into the orbit, it gets closer to the sun, it gets closer to energy that could damage that card today. So the card being built for tomorrow, and we're not talking 10 years from now, we're talking literally next year, next 6 months, even next month. The card that's being built for tomorrow has to be able to sustain those rigors. It cannot have failures, as we talked about earlier. It cannot be built with the expectation that it may have a fault and we can just swap it out and replace it, because you can't just swap it out and replace it. Not today. It needs to be something that the life cycle is going to be 6 years for this piece of equipment, and expect it to be 6 years. So hopefully that helps answer that.
It does, yeah. And I was thinking, obviously, you mentioned automotive as kind of an industry that, from a professionalism point of view, the outer space supply chains have to be. But then I think also vice versa. I could imagine there must be tons of learnings from space supply chains back to the Earth supply chains. I'm just thinking, many years ago when the first moon missions happened, that actually boosted a lot of other industries here on our planet, like all the electronics industries, so consumer electronics got miniaturized. What do you expect? What will then the positive impacts in our supply chains here?
I think the biggest one is building for resiliency rather than replacement. Most supply chains today are expecting that piece of equipment to fail within a certain window. Instead of looking at it that way, which there is a model for the replacement, for the maintenance, everything that goes along with that, we're used to that from a sourcing perspective, dealing with those suppliers and having the contracts in place to maintain whatever equipment you just bought. Instead of looking at it with the suppliers, or you would partner with them and say, hey, rather than build in a failure model where we know 5% or 3% of this equipment is expected to fail within 2 years instead of 3 years, for example, and have a contract that says we're just going to replace this, or maintain this for you. Work with that supplier to ensure that the equipment they're building has a 5-year lifespan or a 6-year lifespan. And if it does fail, it's recoverable in orbit. What that looks like potentially is having the equipment that it's being built from, or the materials that it's being built from, something that can be broken down in orbit and used, like recycled in orbit, and then used to repair or replace other equipment in orbit. We don't think about stuff like that today. If you've got a rack in a data center, you don't necessarily pull it out and put it in some type of recycler and then have it, deconstructed and then built with a new rack, for example. It's not a common thought, right? But if you had technologies that were made out of materials that could be broken down in orbit and then used to recycle and repair in orbit, that would be a great boost to the orbital industry, right? And the second thing is the resilience. Literally, if everything is built from with a qualification rigor that's going to assume that equipment, again, is a 10-year piece of equipment instead of a 3-year piece of equipment, you're going to be benefiting both the environment and the terrestrial, like the original mothership, you could say, that data center was built from. So I think that would be the number one way to look at it. Spacecraft often fly two independent navigation systems because failure isn't an option, right? If dual sourcing on Earth followed the same logic, that equipment, as another example, could be operational 100% of the time. We do that with data centers today with the dual data centers, dual path, dual compute, having geographically diverse locations so to make sure that if you're dropping data at this data center, it's being redundantly dropped over here as well. But looking at that from an orbital perspective, you wouldn't necessarily need to do that if you had equipment that was going to be fail-proof, for example. So resiliency.
John, thank you for sharing. Another point is that satellite supply networks, they're quietly becoming this critical infrastructure for things like communication and logistics tracking here on Earth. How exposed are these terrestrial supply chains to disruption in that layer? And is anyone thinking about that seriously enough?
That's a really good question, and it's not something you often read about in our environment. But when you think about it, like every single thing that we are shipping today has a GPS tracker on it, for example. And aviation routing, telecom synchronization, financial transaction timestamps, they're all coming off of satellite networks, right? So if there is a disruption in orbit, which is potential, right? There are, a piece of equipment floating in space that could conflict a satellite and damage it. There's potential hostile actions that could disrupt a satellite network. It would have a large impact on our current supply chains. If, for example, a ship is coming out of, the Strait of Hormuz, which is in the news today, right? And it's carrying rare earth elements that are going to be going to a manufacturer to build out a chipset or a GPU of some type, right? If that ship's satellite navigation system was disrupted, there are obviously experts on that ship that could probably navigate by stars, by other means. However, if it was automated, or if even a component of that trip was automated, that ship might end up in the wrong location, as an example. Same thing with a driver on a truck in a interstate or something, and his GPS goes down and he doesn't have the printed maps any longer. There is a good chance that he's going to have to stop until the GPS is working, or figure out some other way to understand where his destination is, right? So any disruption in that layer would ripple through logistics, ripple through finance. That delivery is delayed. Now you have a cost impact. Now you have a downstream build impact, et cetera, et cetera. So people do not necessarily think of it that way, but those satellites in orbit are fragile pieces of equipment. They're built to withstand a lot, but it's not foolproof, and they can be damaged. That damage could have a serious impact on any of the terrestrial supply chains, any component of that supply chain.
Thank you, John. I think it's really very exciting. I feel like I learned so much already. It's unbelievable. Now, if I switch a bit gears on putting my head up as a supply chain leader, what is the biggest misconception you would say that people have about, supply chain management in the outer space?
I think people, we've talked a little bit earlier on, that equipment has to be more rigorous. That is an issue. However, it isn't necessarily going to be that different than what we do today. In most cases today, the technology that's going into space is bespoke, right? It's built just for this one application. It's built just for this one satellite. It cannot be plug and play. You cannot duplicate it. It's fabricated on, over a 2-year span just for this one application. But the commercial aspect of orbital technology is going to be a duplicate of today's technology. The supply chain is going to be, following the same fundamentals. As long as you're building in the rigor, it would be the same model. It's the same thing as like aerospace manufacturing today or semiconductor manufacturing, just with tighter tolerances on the equipment, for example. So don't think of it as, hey, I'm going to have to figure out some way to make this technology 100% different than it is right now. You're not doing that. You're only adding in a layer of like tolerances that keep that equipment from failing, but it's not necessarily changing it or how you do things today. You're still going to be shipping the same way. You get it to the only difference is, and instead of shipping to a build location at a hyperscale facility or campus, you're shipping it to a launch facility. The launch facility is then responsible for getting the equipment into orbit, but as a supplier, your actions are literally building it, manufacturing it, getting the components, et cetera, then shipping it to X location, having the contract in place, having, the SLAs in place. Everything that you would normally do is still going to be the same, except once that piece of equipment gets to the launch pad, it's going to be shot into orbit instead of shipped to a different location on the planet, right? Or move from a semi truck to a smaller truck to a van, to get it to a hyperscale facility in Utah, for example. You're going to have the same equipment and it's going to be the same process, but it goes to a launch pad instead. The one component that we've talked about multiple times is just that the tolerances have to be no fault tolerances. Otherwise, look at it the same way.
Thank you for sharing, John. I'm wondering, I sit on a lot of thought leadership councils. We're discussing the future of supply chain management. And if you were advising another supply chain leader out there, outside the space industry, who wanted to learn more, what would you tell them to study?
Personally, how to qualify suppliers. When you're looking at like multi-tier visibility and long lead materials, I think the biggest thing that we don't look at today is supplier qualification. Meta does it, Amazon does it. So a lot of the larger companies will go all the way down to the manufacturing contract from each component manufacturer up, right? Qualifying the supply chain from point A to point Z rather than from point L to point Romeo, for example. Um, if we think of it from, how space programs do it today and manage those long lead materials and have the multi-tier visibility. I know in certain circumstances when I'm doing a contract, often you already have the supply chain built out. It's a renewal. You're not necessarily thinking of it from, do I have to look at it? Where is this equipment coming from? What is happening in that geopolitical environment? What's going on? Globally that could impact that, right? That's where our focus has to be, future-proofing that supply chain to ensure that it's coming from multiple locations. It doesn't have a single point of failure. It doesn't have our current mindset is not that every single component is mission critical, for example, and every supplier is part of that mission critical environment. We often think as supply chain or sourcing leaders that, hey, it's not a big deal if 5% of this doesn't work the right way, or if it lands at the facility and there's a card broken. Hey, no big deal. The supplier will replace that. I have an SLA, right? It'll take a little bit of time, but it's not necessarily a critical issue for the data center. With space, it is. Every single thing has to be looked at that as a mission critical piece of a whole. And that whole is what you're sourcing for or is what you're focusing on, not the individual piece. Think of it holistically. I think future proofing is basically having it as a long-term design principle and not like a contingency plan. So, yeah.
That's makes a lot of sense. If we probably were almost at the end, but if we look a bit into the future, I always like to ask my guests, where do you think obviously the future will go? And in that space, obviously things are moving so fast, but if you want to look 10 years out, what does supply chains for us as humans even mean if part of that is happening outer space? Like, could you give us a bit of your look into the crystal ball?
Yeah, so 10 years from now, I'm thinking it's a multi-layered ecosystem. Literally, right now we're thinking, 2D, right? Everything is based on the planet. If it's built here, it's shipped here, it's moved here. Instead, you're thinking the future is going to be, it could be built, a single piece could be manufactured on Earth. Components could be shipped out to the moon, for example, land on the moon, then have an assembly location on the moon that then launches it into orbit quicker and more easily than like manufacturing on the Earth and then shipping it or launching it directly into orbit. It would literally be a combination of terrestrial, orbital, and lunar supply chains interacting with each other in a way that is seamless and allows each one of those layers to work seamlessly. Sorry, I've said seamlessly twice, but work in conjunction with each other without having a lot of lag time or issues. I think we'd be looking at like managing that infrastructure across multiple environments instead of just a single environment. So I believe, even 5 years from now, the supply chain is going to be multiple layers. Uh, it'll literally have potentially materials sourced on the moon, for example, and having a manufacturing facility on the moon that can take that material and send it back to the Earth, or have the reverse from the Earth to the moon, and then, like I said, putting that thing, whatever that piece of equipment might be, into orbit. We're already looking at that today. I know one of the biggest issues is like power, and how do you power those things? That's being solved. How do you cool things? That's being solved. How do you actually keep it safe? That's being solved. How do you clean up the orbital environment? That's being solved. There's projects to solve every single one of those things literally happening today. So the future supply chain is literally going to be a multi-tiered environment that is interacting with each other on a regular basis, not just a one-way shipping from Earth to orbit, but from orbit back to Earth and vice versa.
John, thank you so much for talking to us today. And I think on behalf of Burkard, it has definitely reframed how we are thinking. It has given us a lot of food for thought for tonight to really understand. And we are so grateful for your time today.
My pleasure. Yeah, my pleasure.
Certainly was. Thank you, John. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, Burkard. That was John Callison on why space is becoming one of the most demanding and instructive supply chain environments out there. Thank you to all our listeners. Thanks once again to John and our co-hosts, Charlotte and Burkard today. I've been Max Kent, and see you on the next episode.